Prologue of Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Prologue. Several years had elapsed since I had found the opportunity to do any big game hunting, for at last I had my plans almost perfected for a return to my old stamping grounds in northern Africa, where in other days I had had excellent sport in pursuit of the king of beasts. The date of my departure had been set. I was to leave in 2 weeks. No schoolboy counting the lagging hours that must pass before the beginning of long vacation released him to the delirious joys of the summer camp could have been filled with greater impatience or keener anticipation. Then came a letter that started me for Africa 12 days ahead of my schedule. Often am I in receipt of letters from strangers who have found something in a story of mine to commend or to condemn. My interest in this department of my correspondence is ever fresh. I opened this particular letter with all the zest of pleasurable anticipation with which I had opened so many others. The postmark, Algiers, had aroused my interest and curiosity, especially at this time, since it was Algiers that was presently to witness the termination of my coming sea voyage in search of sport and adventure. Before the reading of that letter was completed, lions and lion hunting had fled my thoughts, and I was in a state of excitement bordering upon frenzy. Well, read it yourself, and see if you too do not find food for frantic conjecture, for tantalizing doubts, and for a great hope. Here it is. Dear Sir, I think that I have run across one of the most remarkable coincidences in modern literature. But let me start at the beginning. I am by profession a wanderer upon the face of the earth. I have no trade, nor any other occupation. My father bequeathed me a competency. Some remoter ancestors lust to roam. I have combined the two and invested them carefully and without extravagance. I became interested in your story, At the Earth's Core, not so much because of the probability of the tale as of a great and abiding wonder that people should be paid real money for writing such impossible trash. You will pardon my candor, but it is necessary that you understand my mental attitude toward this particular story, that you may credit that which follows. Shortly thereafter I started for the Sahara in search of a rather rare species of antelope that is to be found only occasionally within a limited area at a certain season of the year. My chase led me far from the haunts of man. It was a fruitless search, however, in so far as antelope is concerned, but one night, as I lay courting sleep at the edge of a little cluster of date palms that surround an ancient well in the midst of the arid, shifting sands, I suddenly became conscious of a strange sound coming apparently from the earth beneath my head. It was an intermittent ticking. No reptile or insect with which I am familiar reproduces any such notes. I lay for an hour, listening intently. At last my curiosity got the better of me. I arose, lighted my lamp, and commenced to investigate. My bedding lay upon a rug stretched directly upon the warm sand. The noise appeared to be coming from beneath the rug. I raised it, but found nothing, yet at intervals the sound continued. I dug into the sand with the point of my hunting knife. A few inches below the surface of the sand I encountered a solid substance that had the feel of wood beneath the sharp steel. Excavating about it, I unearthed a small wooden box. From this receptacle issued the strange sound that I had heard. How had it come here? What did it contain? In attempting to lift it from its burying place, I discovered that it seemed to be held fast by means of a very small insulated cable running farther into the sand beneath it. My first impulse was to drag the thing loose by main strength, but fortunately I thought better of this and fell to examining the box. I soon saw that it was covered by a hinged lid, which was held closed by a simple screw hook and eye. It took but a moment to loosen this and raise the cover, when to my utter astonishment I discovered an ordinary telegraph instrument clicking away within. "What in the world," thought I, "is this thing doing here?" That it was a French military instrument was my first guess, but really there didn't seem much likelihood that this was the correct explanation when one took into account the loneliness and remoteness of the spot. As I sat gazing at my remarkable find, which was ticking and clicking away there in the silence of the desert night, trying to convey some message which I was unable to interpret, my eyes fell upon a bit of paper lying in the bottom of the box beside the instrument. I picked it up and examined it. Upon it were written but two letters, D.I. They meant nothing to me then. I was baffled. Once, in an interval of silence upon the part of the receiving instrument, I moved the sending key up and down a few times. Instantly the receiving mechanism commenced to work frantically. I tried to recall something of the Morse code with which I had played as a little boy, but time had obliterated it from my memory. I became almost frantic as I let my imagination run riot among the possibilities for which this clicking instrument might stand. Some poor devil at the unknown other end might be in dire need of succor. The very franticness of the instrument's wild clashing betokened something of the kind. And there sat I, powerless to interpret, and so powerless to help. It was then that the inspiration came to me. In a flash there leaped to my mind the closing paragraphs of the story I had read in the club at Algiers. Does the answer lie somewhere upon the bosom of the broad Sahara, at the ends of two tiny wires, hidden beneath a lost cairn? The idea seemed preposterous. Experience and intelligence combined to assure me that there could be no slightest grain of truth or possibility in your wild tale. It was fiction, pure and simple. And yet where were the other ends of those wires? What was this instrument, ticking away here in the great Sahara, but a travesty upon the possible? Would I have believed in it had I not seen it with my own eyes? And the initials D.I. upon the slip of paper. David's initials were these, David Innes. I smiled at my imaginings. I ridiculed the assumption that there was an inner world, that these wires led downward through the earth's crust to the surface of Pellucidar. And yet, well, I sat there all night, listening to that tantalizing clicking, now and then moving the sending key just to let the other end know that the instrument had been discovered. In the morning, after carefully returning the box to its hole and covering it over with sand, I called my servants about me, snatched a hurried breakfast, mounted my horse, and started upon a forced march for Algiers. I arrived here today. In writing you this letter, I feel that I am making a fool of myself. There is no David Innes. There is no Diane the Beautiful. There is no world within a world. Pellucidar is but a realm of your imagination, nothing more. But the incident of the finding of that buried telegraph instrument upon the lonely Sahara is little short of uncanny, in view of your story of the adventures of David Innes. I have called it one of the most remarkable coincidences in modern fiction. I called it literature before, but, again, pardon my candor, your story is not. And now, why am I writing you? Heaven knows, unless it is that the persistent clicking of that unfathomable enigma out there in the vast silences of the Sahara has so wrought upon my nerves that reason refuses longer to function sanely. I cannot hear it now, yet I know that far away to the south, all alone beneath the sands, it is still pounding out its vain, frantic appeal. It is maddening. It is your fault. I want you to release me from it. Cable me at once, at my expense, that there was no basis of fact for your story at the earth's core. Very respectfully yours, Cogden, Nestor and Club, Algiers, June 1st. 10 minutes after reading this letter, I had cabled Mr. Nestor as follows: "Story true. Await me, Algiers." As fast as train and boat would carry me, I sped toward my destination. For all those dragging days my mind was a whirl of mad conjecture, of frantic hope, of numbing fear. The finding of the telegraph instrument practically assured me that David Innes had driven Perry's iron mole back through the earth's crust to the buried world of Pellucidar. But what adventures had befallen him since his return? Had he found Diane the beautiful, his half-savage mate, safe among his friends, or had Hooja, the sly one, succeeded in his nefarious schemes to abduct her? Did Abner Perry, the lovable old inventor and paleontologist, still live? Had the federated tribes of Pellucidar succeeded in overthrowing the mighty Mayhars, the dominant race of reptilian monsters, and their fierce gorilla-like soldiery, the savage Sagoths? I must admit that I was in a state bordering upon nervous prostration when I entered the An Club in Algiers and inquired for Mr. Nestor. A moment later I was ushered into his presence, to find myself clasping hands with the sort of chap that the world holds only too few of. He was a tall, smooth-faced man of about 30, clean-cut, straight, and strong, and weather-tanned to the hue of a desert Arab. I liked him immensely from the first, and I hoped that after our 3 months together in the desert country, 3 months not entirely lacking in adventure, he found that a man may be a writer of impossible trash and yet have some redeeming qualities. The day following my arrival at Algiers we left for the south, Nestor having made all arrangements in advance, guessing, as he naturally did, that I could be coming to Africa for but a single purpose: to hasten at once to the buried telegraph instrument and wrest its secret from it. In addition to our native servants, we took along an English telegraph operator named Frank Downes. Nothing of interest enlivened our journey by rail and caravan till we came to the cluster of date palms about the ancient well upon the rim of the Sahara. It was the very spot at which I first had seen David Innes. If he had ever raised a cairn above the telegraph instrument, no sign of it remained now. Had it not been for the chance that caused Cogden Nestor to throw down his sleeping rug directly over the hidden instrument, it might still be clicking there, unheard, and this story still unwritten. When we reached the spot and unearthed the little box, the instrument was quiet, nor did repeated attempts upon the part of our telegrapher succeed in winning a response from the other end of the line. After several days of futile endeavor to raise Pellucidar, we had begun to despair. I was as positive that the other end of that little cable protruded through the surface of the inner world as I am that I sit here today in my study, when about midnight of the 4th day I was awakened by the sound of the instrument. Leaping to my feet, I grasped Downes roughly by the neck and dragged him out of his blankets. He didn't need to be told what caused my excitement, for the instant he was awake he too heard the long hoped for click, and with a whoop of delight pounced upon the instrument. Nestor was on his feet almost as soon as I. The three of us huddled about that little box as if our lives depended upon the message it had for us. Downes interrupted the clickings with his sending key. The noise of the receiver stopped instantly. "Ask who it is, Downes," I directed. He did so, and while he awaited the Englishman's translation of the reply, I doubt if either Nestor or I breathed. "He says he's David Innes," said Downes. "He wants to know who we are." "Tell him," said I, "and that we want to know how he is, and all that has befallen him since I last saw him." For 2 months I talked with David Innes almost every day, and as Downes translated, either Nestor or I took notes. From these, arranged in chronological order, I have set down the following account of the further adventures of David Innes at the earth's core, practically in his own words. End of prologue. Chapter 1 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1. Lost on Pellucidar. The Arabs of whom I wrote you at the end of my last letter, Innes began, and whom I thought to be enemies intent only upon murdering me, proved to be exceedingly friendly. They were searching for the very band of marauders that had threatened my existence. The huge Rhamphorhynchus-like reptile that I had brought back with me from the inner world, the ugly Mayhar that Hooja the Sly One had substituted for my dear Diane at the moment of my departure, filled them with wonder and with awe. Nor less so did the mighty subterranean prospector which had carried me to Pellucidar and back again, and which lay out in the desert about 2 miles from my camp. With their help I managed to get the unwieldy tons of its great bulk into a vertical position, the nose deep in a hole we had dug in the sand, and the rest of it supported by the trunks of date palms cut for the purpose. It was a mighty engineering job, with only wild Arabs and their wilder mounts to do the work of an electric crane, but finally it was completed, and I was ready for departure. For some time I hesitated to take the Mayhar back with me. She had been docile and quiet ever since she had discovered herself virtually a prisoner aboard the Iron Mole. It had been, of course, impossible for me to communicate with her, since she had no auditory organs and I no knowledge of her fourth dimension, sixth sense method of communication. Naturally I am kind-hearted, and so I found it beyond me to leave even this hateful and repulsive thing alone in a strange and hostile world. The result was that when I entered the iron mold I took her with me. That she knew that we were about to return to Pellucidar was evident, for immediately her manner changed from that of habitual gloom that had pervaded her to an almost human expression of contentment and delight. Our trip through the earth's crust was but a repetition of my 2 former journeys between the inner and the outer worlds. This time, however, I imagine that we must have maintained a more nearly perpendicular course, for we accomplished the journey in a few minutes less time than upon the occasion of my first journey through the 500-mile crust, just a trifle less than 72 hours after our departure into the sands of the Sahara. We broke through the surface of Pellucidar. Fortune once again favored me by the slightest of margins, for when I opened the door in the prospector's outer jacket, I saw that we had missed coming up through the bottom of an ocean by but a few hundred yards. The aspect of the surrounding country was entirely unfamiliar to me. I had no conception of precisely where I was upon the 124 million square miles of Pellucidar's vast land surface. The perpetual midday sun poured down its torrid rays from its zenith, as it had done since the beginning of Pellucidarian time, as it would continue to do to the end of it. Before me, across the wide sea, the weird horizonless seascape folded gently upward to meet the sky, until it lost itself to view in the azure depths of distance, far above the level of my eyes. How strange it looked! How vastly different from the flat and puny area of the circumscribed vision of the dweller upon the outer crust! I was lost. Though I wandered ceaselessly throughout a lifetime, I might never discover the whereabouts of my former friends of this strange and savage world. Never again might I see dear old Perry, nor Gok the hairy one, nor Dacor the strong one, nor that other infinitely precious one, my sweet and noble mate, Diane the beautiful. But even so I was glad to tread once more the surface of Pellucidar. Mysterious and terrible, grotesque and savage though she is in many of her aspects, I cannot but love her. Her very savagery appealed to me, for it is the savagery of unspoiled nature. The magnificence of her tropic beauties enthralled me. Her mighty land areas breathed unfettered freedom. Her untracked oceans, whispering of virgin wonders, unsullied by the eye of man, beckoned me out upon their restless bosoms. Not for an instant did I regret the world of my nativity. I was in Pellucidar. I was home, and I was content. As I stood dreaming beside the giant thing that had brought me safely through the earth's crust, my traveling companion, the hideous Mayhar, emerged from the interior of the prospector and stood beside me. For a long time she remained motionless. What thoughts were passing through the convolutions of her reptilian brain, I do not know. She was a member of the dominant race of Pellucidar. By a strange freak of evolution, her kind had first developed the power of reason in that world of anomalies. To her, creatures such as I were of a lower order. As Perry had discovered among the writings of her kind in the buried city of Phutra, it was still an open question among the Mayhars as to whether man possessed means of intelligent communication or the power of reason. Her kind believed that in the center of all-pervading solidity there was a single vast spherical cavity, which was Pellucidar. This cavity had been left there for the sole purpose of providing a place for the creation and propagation of the Mayhar race. Everything within it had been put there for the uses of the Mayhar. I wondered what this particular Mayhar might think now. I found pleasure in speculating upon just what the effect had been upon her of passing through the earth's crust and coming out into a world that one of even less intelligence than the great Mayhars could easily see was a different world from her own Pellucidar. What had she thought of the outer world's tiny sun? What had been the effect upon her of the moon and myriad stars of the clear African nights? How had she explained them? With what sensations of awe must she first have watched the sun moving slowly across the heavens to disappear at last beneath the western horizon, leaving in his wake that which the Mayhar had never before witnessed, the darkness of night. For upon Pellucidar there is no night. The stationary sun hangs forever in the center of the Pellucidarian sky, directly overhead. Then, too, she must have been impressed by the wondrous mechanism of the prospector which had bored its way from world to world and back again, and that it had been driven by a rational being must also have occurred to her. Too, she had seen me conversing with other men upon the earth's surface. She had seen the arrival of the caravan of books and arms and ammunition, and the balance of the heterogeneous collection which I had crammed into the cabin of the iron mole for transportation to Pellucidar. She had seen all these evidences of a civilization and brain power transcending in scientific achievement anything that her race had produced. Nor once had she seen a creature of her own kind. There could have been but a single deduction in the mind of the Mayhar: there were other worlds than Pellucidar, and the Gilak was a rational being. Now the creature at my side was creeping slowly toward the nearby sea. At my hip hung a long-barreled six-shooter. Somehow I had been unable to find the same sensation of security in the newfangled automatics that had been perfected since my first departure from the outer world, and in my hand was a heavy express rifle. I could have shot the Mayhar with ease, for I knew intuitively that she was escaping, but I did not. I felt that if she could return to her own kind with the story of her adventures, the position of the human race within Pellucidar would be advanced immensely at a single stride, for at once man would take his proper place in the considerations of the reptilia. At the edge of the sea the creature paused and looked back at me. Then she slid sinuously into the surf. For several minutes I saw no more of her as she luxuriated in the cool depths. Then 100 yards from shore she rose, and there for another short while she floated upon the surface. Finally she spread her giant wings, flapped them vigorously a score of times, and rose above the blue sea. A single time she circled far aloft, and then straight as an arrow she sped away. I watched her until the distant haze enveloped her and she had disappeared. I was alone. My first concern was to discover where within Pellucidar I might be, and in what direction lay the land of the Sarians, where Gok, the hairy one, ruled. But how was I to guess in which direction lay Sari? And if I set out to search, what then? Could I find my way back to the prospector with its priceless freight of books, firearms, ammunition, scientific instruments, and still more books in its great library of reference works upon every conceivable branch of applied sciences? And if I could not, of what value was all this vast storehouse of potential civilization and progress to be to the world of my adoption? Upon the other hand, if I remained here alone with it, what could I accomplish single-handed? Nothing. But where there was no east, no west, no north, no south, no stars, no moon, and only a stationary midday sun, how was I to find my way back to this spot should ever I get out of sight of it? I didn't know. For a long time I stood buried in deep thought, when it occurred to me to try out one of the compasses I had brought and ascertain if it remained steadily fixed upon an unvarying pole. I re-entered the prospector and fetched a compass without. Moving a considerable distance from the prospector that the needle might not be influenced by its great bulk of iron and steel, I turned the delicate instrument about in every direction. Always and steadily the needle remained rigidly fixed upon a point straight out to sea, apparently pointing toward a large island some 10 or 20 miles distant. This, then, should be north. I drew my notebook from my pocket and made a careful topographical sketch of the locality within the range of my vision. Due north lay the island, far out upon the shimmering sea. The spot I had chosen for my observations was the top of a large, flat boulder which rose 6 or 8 feet above the turf. This spot I called Greenwich. The boulder was the Royal Observatory. I had made a start. I cannot tell you what a sense of relief was imparted to me by the simple fact that there was at least one spot within Pellucidar with a familiar name and a place upon a map. It was with almost childish joy that I made a little circle in my notebook and traced the word Greenwich beside it. Now I felt I might start out upon my search with some assurance of finding my way back again to the prospector. I decided that at first I would travel directly south in the hope that I might in that direction find some familiar landmark. It was as good a direction as any. This much at least might be said of it. Among the many other things I had brought from the outer world were a number of pedometers. I slipped 3 of these into my pockets with the idea that I might arrive at a more or less accurate mean from the registrations of them all. On my map I would register so many paces south, so many east, and so many west, and so on. When I was ready to return, I would then do so by any route that I might choose. I also strapped a considerable quantity of ammunition across my shoulders, pocketed some matches, and hooked an aluminum fry pan and a small stew kettle of the same metal to my belt. I was ready to go forth and explore a world. Ready to search a land area of 124,110,000 square miles for my friends, my incomparable mate, and good old Perry. And so, after locking the door in the outer shell of the prospector, I set out upon my quest. Due south I traveled across lovely valleys thick dotted with grazing herds. Through dense primeval forests I forced my way, and up the slopes of mighty mountains, searching for a pass to their farther sides. Ibex and musk sheep fell before my good old revolver, so that I lacked not for food in the higher altitudes. The forests and the plains gave plentifully of fruits and wild birds, antelope, aurochsen, and elk. Occasionally, for the larger game animals and the gigantic beasts of prey, I used my express rifle, but for the most part the revolver filled all my needs. There were times, too, when faced by a mighty cave bear, a saber-toothed tiger, or huge Felis spelaea, black-maned and terrible, even my powerful rifle seemed pitifully inadequate. But fortune favored me, so that I passed unscathed through adventures that even the recollection of caused the short hairs to bristle at the nape of my neck. How long I wandered toward the south I do not know, for shortly after I left the prospector something went wrong with my watch, and I was again at the mercy of the baffling timelessness of Pellucidar, forging steadily ahead beneath the great motionless sun which hangs eternally at noon. I ate many times, however, so that days must have elapsed, possibly months, with no familiar landscape rewarding my eager eyes. I saw no men nor signs of men. Nor is this strange, for Pellucidar in its land area is immense, while the human race there is very young and consequently far from numerous. Doubtless upon that long search mine was the first human foot to touch the soil in many places, mine the first human eye to rest upon the gorgeous wonders of the landscape. It was a staggering thought. I could not but dwell upon it often as I made my lonely way through this virgin world. Then, quite suddenly, one day I stepped out of the peace of manless primality into the presence of man, and peace was gone. It happened thus. I had been following a ravine downward out of a chain of lofty hills, and had paused at its mouth to view the lovely little valley that lay before me. At one side was tangled wood, while straight ahead a river wound peacefully along parallel to the cliffs in which the hills terminated at the valley's edge. Presently, as I stood enjoying the lovely scene, as insatiate for nature's wonders as if I had not looked upon similar landscapes countless times, a sound of shouting broke from the direction of the woods. That the harsh, discordant notes rose from the throats of men I could not doubt. I slipped behind a large boulder near the mouth of the ravine and waited. I could hear the crashing of underbrush in the forest, and I guessed that whoever came quickly, pursued and pursuers doubtless. In a short time some hunted animal would break into view, and a moment later a score of half-naked savages would come leaping after with spears or club or great stone knives. I had seen the thing so many times during my life within Pellucidar that I felt that I could anticipate to a nicety precisely what I was about to witness. I hoped that the hunters would prove friendly and be able to direct me toward Sari. Even as I was thinking these thoughts, the quarry emerged from the forest, but it was no terrified four-footed beast. Instead, what I saw was an old man, a terrified old man, staggering feebly and hopelessly from what must have been some very terrible fate, if one could judge from the horrified expressions he continually cast behind him toward the wood. He came stumbling on in my direction. He had covered but a short distance from the forest when I beheld the first of his pursuers, a Sagoth, one of those grim and terrible gorilla men who guard the mighty Mayhars in their buried cities, faring forth from time to time upon slave raiding or punitive expeditions against the human race of Pellucidar, of whom the dominant race of the inner world think as we think of the bison or the wild sheep of our own world. Close behind the foremost Sagoth came others until a full dozen raced, shouting after the terror-stricken old man. They would be upon him shortly, that was plain. One of them was rapidly overhauling him, his back-thrown spear-arm testifying to his purpose. And then, quite with the suddenness of an unexpected blow, I realized a past familiarity with the gait and carriage of the fugitive. Simultaneously there swept over me the staggering fact that the old man was Perry, that he was about to die before my very eyes with no hope that I could reach him in time to avert the awful catastrophe. For to me it meant a real catastrophe. Perry was my best friend. Diane, of course, I looked upon as more than friend. She was my mate, a part of me. I had entirely forgotten the rifle in my hand and the revolvers at my belt. One does not readily synchronize his thoughts with the Stone Age and the 20th century simultaneously. Now, from past habit, I still thought in the Stone Age, and in my thoughts of the Stone Age there were no thoughts of firearms. The fellow was almost upon Perry when the feel of the gun in my hand awoke me from the lethargy of terror that had gripped me. From behind my boulder I threw up the heavy express rifle, a mighty engine of destruction that might bring down a cave bear or a mammoth at a single shot, and let drive at the Sagoth's broad, hairy breast. At the sound of the shot he stopped, stock still. His spear dropped from his hand. Then he lunged forward upon his face. The effect upon the others was little less remarkable. Perry alone could have possibly guessed the meaning of the loud report or explained its connection with the sudden collapse of the Sagoth. The other gorilla men halted for but an instant. Then, with renewed shrieks of rage, they sprang forward to finish Perry. At the same time, I stepped from behind my boulder, drawing one of my revolvers that I might conserve the more precious ammunition of the express rifle. Quickly I fired again with the lesser weapon. Then it was that all eyes were directed toward me. Another Sagoth fell to the bullet from the revolver, but it did not stop his companions. They were out for revenge as well as blood now, and they meant to have both. As I ran forward toward Perry, I fired 4 more shots, dropping 3 of our antagonists. Then at last the remaining 7 wavered. It was too much for them, this roaring death that leaped, invisible, upon them from a great distance. As they hesitated, I reached Perry's side. I have never seen such an expression upon any man's face as that upon Perry's when he recognized me. I have no words wherewith to describe it. There was not time to talk then, scarce for a greeting. I thrust the full loaded revolver into his hand, fired the last shot in my own, and reloaded. There were but 6 Sagoths left. They started toward us once more, though I could see that they were terrified probably as much by the noise of the guns as by their effects. They never reached us. Halfway, the 3 that remained turned and fled, and we let them go. The last we saw of them, they were disappearing into the tangled undergrowth of the forest. And then Perry turned and threw his arms about my neck, and burying his old face upon my shoulder, wept like a child. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 2. Traveling with Terror. We made camp there beside the peaceful river. There Perry told me all that had befallen him since I had departed for the outer crust. It seemed that Hooja had made it appear that I had intentionally left Diane behind, and that I did not purpose ever returning to Pellucidar. He told them that I was of another world, and that I had tired of this and of its inhabitants. To Diane he had explained that I had a mate in the world to which I was returning, that I had never intended taking Diane the Beautiful back with me, and that she had seen the last of me. Shortly afterward Diane had disappeared from the camp, nor had Perry seen or heard aught of her since. He had no conception of the time that had elapsed since I had departed, but guessed that many years had dragged their slow way into the past. Hooja, too, had disappeared very soon after Diane had left. The Saurians under Gok, the hairy one, and the Amazighites under Dakor, the strong one, Diane's brother, had fallen out over my supposed defection, for Gok would not believe that I had thus treacherously deceived and deserted them. The result had been that these 2 powerful tribes had fallen upon one another with the new weapons that Perry and I had taught them to make and to use. Other tribes of the new federation took sides with the original disputants or set up petty revolutions of their own. The result was the total demolition of the work we had so well started. Taking advantage of the tribal war, the Mayhars had gathered their Sagoths in force and fallen upon one tribe after another in rapid succession, wreaking awful havoc among them, and reducing them for the most part to as pitiable a state of terror as that from which we had raised them. Alone of all the once mighty federation, the Saurians and the Amozite, with a few other tribes, continued to maintain their defiance of the Mayhars. But these tribes were still divided among themselves, nor had it seemed at all probable to Perry, when he had last been among them, that any attempt at reamalgamation would be made. "And thus, your Majesty," he concluded, "has faded back into oblivion of the Stone Age our wondrous dream, and with it has gone the first empire of Pellucidar." We both had to smile at the use of my royal title, yet I was indeed still Emperor of Pellucidar, and some day I meant to rebuild what the vile act of the treacherous Hooja had torn down. But first I would find my Empress. To me she was worth 40 empires. "Have you no clue as to the whereabouts of Diane?" I asked. "None whatever," replied Perry. "It was in search of her that I came to the pretty pass in which you discovered me, and from which, David, you saved me. I knew perfectly well that you had not intentionally deserted either Diane or Pellucidar. I guessed that in some way Hooja, the sly one, was at the bottom of the matter, and I determined to go to Amos, where I guessed that Diane might come to the protection of her brother, and do my utmost to convince her, and through her Decor, the strong one, that we had all been victims of a treacherous plot to which you were no party. I came to Amos after a most trying and terrible journey, only to find that Diane was not among her brother's people, and that they knew not of her whereabouts. Decor, I am sure, wanted to be fair and just, but so great were his grief and anger over the disappearance of his sister that he could not listen to reason, but kept repeating time and again that only your return to Pellucidar could prove the honesty of your intentions. Then came a stranger from another tribe, sent, I am sure, at the instigation of Hooja. He so turned the Amazites against me that I was forced to flee their country to escape assassination. In attempting to return to Sari, I became lost, and then the Sagoths discovered me. For a long time I eluded them, hiding in caves and wading in rivers to throw them off my trail. I lived on nuts and fruits and the edible roots that chance threw in my way. I traveled on and on, in what directions I could not even guess, and at last I could elude them no longer, and the end came as I had long foreseen that it would come, except that I had not foreseen that you would be there to save me. We rested in our camp until Perry had regained sufficient strength to travel again. We planned much, rebuilding all our shattered air castles, but above all we planned most to find Diane. I could not believe that she was dead, yet where she might be in this savage world and under what frightful conditions she might be living, I could not guess. When Perry was rested, we returned to the prospector, where he fitted himself out fully like a civilized human being: underclothing, socks, shoes, khaki jacket and breeches, and good substantial puttees. When I had come upon him, he was clothed in rough sadok sandals, a G-string and a tunic fashioned from the shaggy hide of a thag. Now he wore real clothing again for the first time since the ape folk had stripped us of our apparel that long gone day that had witnessed our advent within Pellucidar. With a bandolier of cartridges across his shoulder, 2 6-shooters at his hips, and a rifle in his hand, he was a much rejuvenated Perry. Indeed, he was quite a different person altogether from the rather shaky old man who had entered the prospector with me 10 or 11 years before, for the trial trip that had plunged us into such wondrous adventures and into such a strange and hitherto undreamed of world. Now he was straight and active. His muscles, almost atrophied from disuse in his former life, had filled out. He was still an old man, of course, but instead of appearing 10 years older than he really was, as he had when we left the outer world, he now appeared about 10 years younger. The wild, free life of Pellucidar had worked wonders for him. Well, it must need have done so, or killed him, for a man of Perry's former physical condition could not long have survived the dangers and rigors of the primitive life of the inner world. Perry had been greatly interested in my map and in the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. By use of the pedometers we had retraced our way to the prospector with ease and accuracy. Now that we were ready to set out again, we decided to follow a different route on the chance that it might lead us into more familiar territory. I shall not weary you with a repetition of the countless adventures of our long search. Encounters with wild beasts of gigantic size were of almost daily occurrence, but with our deadly express rifles we ran comparatively little risk when one recalls that previously we had both traversed this world of frightful dangers inadequately armed with crude, primitive weapons and all but naked. We ate and slept many times, so many that we lost count, and so I do not know how long we roamed, though our map shows the distances and directions quite accurately. We must have covered a great many thousand square miles of territory, and yet we had seen nothing in the way of a familiar landmark, when from the heights of a mountain range we were crossing, I descried far in the distance great masses of billowing clouds. Now clouds are practically unknown in the skies of Pellucidar. The moment that my eyes rested upon them, my heart leaped. I seized Perry's arm and pointing toward the horizonless distance, shouted, "The mountains of the clouds!" "They lie close to Phutra and the country of our worst enemies, the Mayhars," Perry remonstrated. "I know it," I replied, "but they give us a starting point from which to prosecute our search intelligently. They are at least a familiar landmark. They tell us that we are upon the right trail and not wandering far in the wrong direction. Furthermore, close to the mountains of the clouds dwells a good friend, Ja, the Mezop. You did not know him, but you know all that he did for me and all that he will gladly do to aid me. At least he can direct us upon the right direction toward Sari." "The mountains of the clouds constitute a mighty range," replied Perry. "They must cover an enormous territory. How are you to find your friend in all the great country that is visible from their rugged flanks?" "Easily," I answered him, "for Ja gave me minute directions. I recall almost his exact words. 'You need merely come to the foot of the highest peak of the mountains of the clouds. There you will find a river that flows into the Lural Az. Directly opposite the mouth of the river you will see three large islands far out, so far that they are barely discernible. The one to the extreme left as you face them from the mouth of the river is Anauroch, where I rule the tribe of Anauroch." And so we hastened onward toward the great cloud mass that was to be our guide for several weary marches. At last we came close to the towering crags, Alp-like in their grandeur. Rising nobly among its noble fellows, one stupendous peak reared its giant head thousands of feet above the others. It was he whom we sought, but at its foot no river wound down toward any sea. "It must rise from the opposite side," suggested Perry, casting a rueful glance at the forbidding heights that barred our further progress. "We cannot endure the arctic cold of those high flung passes, and to traverse the endless miles about this interminable range might require a year or more. The land we seek must lie upon the opposite side of the mountains." "Then we must cross them," I insisted. Perry shrugged. "We can't do it, David," he repeated. "We are dressed for the tropics. We should freeze to death among the snows and glaciers long before we had discovered a pass to the opposite side." "We must cross them," I reiterated. "We will cross them." I had a plan, and that plan we carried out. It took some time. First we made a permanent camp part way up the slopes where there was good water. Then we set out in search of the great shaggy cave bear of the higher altitudes. He is a mighty animal, a terrible animal. He is but little larger than his cousin of the lesser, lower hills, but he makes up for it in the awfulness of his ferocity and in the length and thickness of his shaggy coat. It was his coat that we were after. We came upon him quite unexpectedly. I was trudging in advance along a rocky trail worn smooth by the padded feet of countless ages of wild beasts. At a shoulder of the mountain around which the path ran, I came face to face with the Titan. I was going up for a fur coat. He was coming down for breakfast. Each realized that here was the very thing he sought. With a horrid roar the beast charged me. At my right the cliff rose straight upward for thousands of feet. At my left it dropped into a dim, abysmal cañon. In front of me was the bear. Behind me was Perry. I shouted to him in warning, and then I raised my rifle and fired into the broad breast of the creature. There was no time to take aim. The thing was too close upon me. But that my bullet took effect was evident from the howl of rage and pain that broke from the frothing jowls. It didn't stop him, though. I fired again, and then he was upon me. Down I went beneath his ton of maddened, clawing flesh and bone and sinew. I thought my time had come. I remember feeling sorry for poor old Perry, left all alone in this inhospitable, savage world. And then of a sudden I realized that the bear was gone and that I was quite unharmed. I leaped to my feet, my rifle still clutched in my hand, and looked about for my antagonist. I thought that I should find him farther down the trail, probably finishing Perry, and so I leaped in the direction I supposed him to be, to find Perry perched upon a projecting rock several feet above the trail. My cry of warning had given him time to reach this point of safety. There he squatted, his eyes wide and his mouth ajar, the picture of abject terror and consternation. "Where is he?" he cried when he saw me. "Where is he?" "Didn't he come this way?" I asked. "Nothing came this way," replied the old man. "But I heard his roars. He must have been as large as an elephant." "He was," I admitted. "But where in the world do you suppose he disappeared to?" Then came a possible explanation to my mind. I returned to the point at which the bear had hurled me down and peered over the edge of the cliff into the abyss below. Far, far down I saw a small brown blotch near the bottom of the cañon. It was the bear. My second shot must have killed him, and so his dead body, after hurling me to the path, had toppled over into the abyss. I shivered at the thought of how close I too must have been to going over with him. It took us a long time to reach the carcass, and arduous labor to remove the great pelt. But at last the thing was accomplished, and we returned to camp, dragging the heavy trophy behind us. Here we devoted another considerable period to scraping and curing it. When this was done to our satisfaction, we made heavy boots, trousers, and coats of the shaggy skin, turning the fur in. From the scraps we fashioned caps that came down around our ears, with flaps that fell about our shoulders and breasts. We were now fairly well equipped for our search for a pass to the opposite side of the mountains of the clouds. Our first step now was to move our camp upward to the very edge of the perpetual snows which cap this lofty range. Here we built a snug, secure little hut, which we provisioned and stored with fuel for its diminutive fireplace. With our hut as a base, we sallied forth in search of a pass across the range. Our every move was carefully noted upon our maps, which we now kept in duplicate. By this means we were saved tedious and unnecessary retracing of ways already explored. Systematically we worked upward in both directions from our base, and when we had at last discovered what seemed might prove a feasible pass, we moved our belongings to a new hut farther up. It was hard work, cold, bitter, cruel work. Not a step did we take in advance, but the grim reaper strode silently in our tracks. There were the great cave bears in the timber, and gaunt, lean wolves, huge creatures twice the size of our Canadian timber wolves. Farther up we were assailed by enormous white bears, hungry, devilish fellows, who came roaring across the rough glacier tops at the first glimpse of us, or stalked us stealthily by scent when they had not yet seen us. It is one of the peculiarities of life within Pellucidar that man is more often the hunted than the hunter. Myriad are the huge-bellied carnivora of this primitive world. Never from birth to death are those great bellies sufficiently filled, so always are their mighty owners prowling about in search of meat. Terribly armed for battle as they are, man presents to them in his primal state an easy prey, slow of foot, puny of strength, ill-equipped by nature with natural weapons of defense. The bears looked upon us as easy meat. Only our heavy rifles saved us from prompt extinction. Poor Perry never was a raging lion at heart, and I am convinced that the terrors of that awful period must have caused him poignant mental anguish. When we were abroad, pushing our trail farther and farther toward the distant break which, we assumed, marked a feasible way across the range, we never knew at what second some great engine of clawed and fanged destruction might rush upon us from behind, or lie in wait for us beyond an ice hummock or a jutting shoulder of the craggy steeps. The roar of our rifles was constantly shattering the world-old silence of stupendous cañons upon which the eye of man had never before gazed. And when in the comparative safety of our hut we lay down to sleep, the great beasts roared and fought without the walls, clawed and battered at the door, or rushed their colossal frames headlong against the hut's sides until it rocked and trembled to the impact. Yes, it was a gay life. Perry had got to taking stock of our ammunition each time we returned to the hut. It became something of an obsession with him. He'd count our cartridges one by one, and then try to figure how long it would be before the last was expended, and we must either remain in the hut until we starved to death, or venture forth empty to fill the belly of some hungry bear. I must admit that I too felt worried, for our progress was indeed snail-like, and our ammunition could not last forever. In discussing the problem, finally we came to the decision to burn our bridges behind us and make one last supreme effort to cross the divide. It would mean that we must go without sleep for a long period, and with the further chance that when the time came that sleep could no longer be denied, we might still be high in the frozen regions of perpetual snow and ice, where sleep would mean certain death, exposed as we would be to the attacks of wild beasts and without shelter from the hideous cold. But we decided that we must take these chances, and so at last we set forth from our hut for the last time, carrying such necessities as we felt we could least afford to do without. The bears seemed unusually troublesome and determined that time, and as we clambered slowly upward beyond the highest point to which we had previously attained, the cold became infinitely more intense. Presently, with two great bears dogging our footsteps, we entered a dense fog. We had reached the heights that are so often cloud-wrapped for long periods. We could see nothing a few paces beyond our noses. We dared not turn back into the teeth of the bears which we could hear grunting behind us. To meet them in this bewildering fog would have been to court instant death. Perry was almost overcome by the hopelessness of our situation. He flopped down on his knees and began to pray. It was the first time I had heard him at his old habit since my return to Pellucidar, and I had thought that he had given up his little idiosyncrasy, but he hadn't, far from it. I let him pray for a short time undisturbed, and then, as I was about to suggest that we had better be pushing along, one of the bears in our rear let out a roar that made the earth fairly tremble beneath our feet. It brought Perry to his feet as if he had been stung by a wasp, and sent him racing ahead through the blinding fog at a gait that I knew must soon end in disaster were it not checked. Crevasses in the glacier ice were far too frequent to permit of reckless speed even in a clear atmosphere, and then there were hideous precipices along the edges of which our way often led us. I shivered as I thought of the poor old fellow's peril. At the top of my lungs I called to him to stop, but he did not answer me, and then I hurried on in the direction he had gone, faster by far than safety dictated. For a while I thought I heard him ahead of me, but at last, though I paused often to listen and to call to him, I heard nothing more, not even the grunting of the bears that had been behind us. All was deathly silence, the silence of the tomb. About me lay the thick, impenetrable fog. I was alone. Perry was gone, gone forever, I had not the slightest doubt. Somewhere near by lay the mouth of a treacherous fissure, and far down at its icy bottom lay all that was mortal of my old friend, Abner Perry. There would his body be preserved in its icy sepulchre for countless ages, until on some far distant day the slow-moving river of ice had wound its snail-like way down to the warmer level, there to disgorge its grisly evidence of grim tragedy, and what in that far future age might mean baffling mystery. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 3. Shooting the Chutes and After. Through the fog I felt my way along by means of my compass. I no longer heard the bears, nor did I encounter one within the fog. Experience has since taught me that these great beasts are as terror-stricken by this phenomenon as a landsman by a fog at sea, and that no sooner does a fog envelop them than they make the best of their way to lower levels and a clear atmosphere. It was well for me that this was true. I felt very sad and lonely as I crawled along the difficult footing. My own predicament weighed less heavily upon me than the loss of Perry, for I loved the old fellow. That I should ever win the opposite slopes of the range I began to doubt, for though I am naturally sanguine, I imagine that the bereavement which had befallen me had cast such a gloom over my spirits that I could see no slightest ray of hope for the future. Then, too, the blighting gray oblivion of the cold, damp clouds through which I wandered was distressing. Hope thrives best in sunlight, and I am sure that it does not thrive at all in a fog. But the instinct of self-preservation is stronger than hope. It thrives, fortunately, upon nothing. It takes root upon the brink of the grave, and blossoms in the jaws of death. Now it flourished bravely upon the breast of dead hope, and urged me onward and upward in a stern endeavor to justify its existence. As I advanced, the fog became denser. I could see nothing beyond my nose. Even the snow and ice I trod were invisible. I could not see below the breast of my bearskin coat. I seemed to be floating in a sea of vapor. To go forward over a dangerous glacier under such conditions was little short of madness, but I could not have stopped going had I known positively that death lay 2 paces before my nose. In the first place, it was too cold to stop, and in the second, I should have gone mad but for the excitement of the perils that beset each forward step. For some time the ground had been rougher and steeper, until I had been forced to scale a considerable height that had carried me from the glacier entirely. I was sure from my compass that I was following the right general direction, and so I kept on. Once more the ground was level. From the wind that blew about me I guessed that I must be upon some exposed peak of ridge. And then quite suddenly I stepped out into space. Wildly I turned and clutched at the ground that had slipped from beneath my feet. Only a smooth, icy surface was there. I found nothing to clutch or stay my fall, and a moment later so great was my speed that nothing could have stayed me. As suddenly as I had pitched into space, with equal suddenness did I emerge from the fog, out of which I shot like a projectile from a cannon into clear daylight. My speed was so great that I could see nothing about me but a blurred and indistinct sheet of smooth and frozen snow that rushed past me with express train velocity. I must have slid downward thousands of feet before the steep incline curved gently on to a broad, smooth, snow-covered plateau. Across this I hurtled with slowly diminishing velocity, until at last objects about me began to take definite shape. Far ahead, miles and miles away, I saw a great valley and mighty woods, and beyond these a broad expanse of water. In the nearer foreground I discerned a small dark blob of color upon the shimmering whiteness of the snow. A bear, thought I, and thanked the instinct that had impelled me to cling tenaciously to my rifle during the moments of my awful tumble. At the rate I was going, it would be but a moment before I should be quite abreast the thing, nor was it long before I came to a sudden stop in soft snow, upon which the sun was shining, not 20 paces from the object of my most immediate apprehension. It was standing upon its hind legs, waiting for me. As I scrambled to my feet to meet it, I dropped my gun in the snow and doubled up with laughter. It was Perry. The expression upon his face, combined with the relief I felt at seeing him again safe and sound, was too much for my overwrought nerves. "David!" he cried. "David, my boy! God has been good to an old man. He has answered my prayer." It seems that Perry in his mad flight had plunged over the brink at about the same point as that at which I had stepped over it a short time later. Chance had done for us what long periods of rational labor had failed to accomplish. We had crossed the divide. We were upon the side of the mountains of the clouds that we had for so long been attempting to reach. We looked about. Below us were green trees and warm jungles. In the distance was a great sea. "The Laurel Az," I said, pointing toward its blue-green surface. Somehow the gods alone can explain it. Perry, too, had clung to his rifle during his mad descent of the icy slope. For that there was cause for great rejoicing. Neither of us was worse for his experience, so after shaking the snow from our clothing, we set off at a great rate down toward the warmth and comfort of the forest and the jungle. The going was easy by comparison with the awful obstacles we had had to encounter upon the opposite side of the divide. There were beasts, of course, but we came through safely. Before we halted to eat or rest, we stood beside a little mountain brook beneath the wondrous trees of the primeval forest in an atmosphere of warmth and comfort. It reminded me of an early June day in the Maine woods. We fell to work with our short axes and cut enough small trees to build a rude protection from the fiercer beasts. Then we lay down to sleep. How long we slept I do not know. Perry says that inasmuch as there is no means of measuring time within Pellucidar, there can be no such thing as time here, and that we may have slept an outer earthly year, or we may have slept but a second. But this I know: we had stuck the ends of some of the saplings into the ground in the building of our shelter, first stripping the leaves and branches from them, and when we awoke we found that many of them had thrust forth sprouts. Personally, I think that we slept at least a month, but who may say? The sun marked midday when we closed our eyes. It was still in the same position when we opened them, nor had it varied a hair's breadth in the interim. It is most baffling, this question of elapsed time within Pellucidar. Anyhow, I was famished when we awoke. I think that it was the pangs of hunger that awoke me. Ptarmigan and wild boar fell before my revolver within a dozen moments of my awakening. Perry soon had a roaring fire blazing by the brink of the little stream. It was a good and delicious meal we made. Though we did not eat the entire boar, we made a very large hole in him, while the ptarmigan was but a mouthful. Having satisfied our hunger, we determined to set forth at once in search of Anauroch and my old friend Ja the Mezop. We each thought that by following the little stream downward, we should come upon the large river which Ja had told me emptied into the Laurel Az opposite his island. We did so, nor were we disappointed, for at last, after a pleasant journey, and what journey would not be pleasant after the hardships we had endured among the peaks of the mountains of the clouds, we came upon a broad flood that rushed majestically onward in the direction of the great sea we had seen from the snowy slopes of the mountains. For 3 long marches we followed the left bank of the growing river, until at last we saw it roll its mighty volume into the vast waters of the sea. Far out across the rippling ocean we descried 3 islands. The one to the left must be Anauroch. At last we had come close to a solution of our problem, the road to Sari. But how to reach the islands was now the foremost question in our minds. We must build a canoe. Perry is a most resourceful man. He has an axiom which carries the thought kernel that what man has done, man can do, and it doesn't cut any figure with Perry whether a fellow knows how to do it or not. He set out to make gunpowder once, shortly after our escape from Phutra, and at the beginning of the confederation of the wild tribes of Pellucidar. He said that someone without any knowledge of the fact that such a thing might be concocted had once stumbled upon it by accident, and so he couldn't see why a fellow who knew all about powder except how to make it couldn't do as well. He worked mighty hard mixing all sorts of things together, until finally he evolved a substance that looked like powder. He had been very proud of the stuff, and had gone about the village of the Sarians exhibiting it to everyone who would listen to him, and explaining what its purpose was and what terrific havoc it would work, until finally the natives became so terrified at the stuff that they wouldn't come within a rod of Perry and his invention. Finally I suggested that we experiment with it and see what it would do. So Perry built a fire after placing the powder at a safe distance, and then touched a glowing ember to a minute particle of the deadly explosive. It extinguished the ember. Repeated experiments with it determined me that in searching for a high explosive, Perry had stumbled upon a fire extinguisher that would have made his fortune for him back in our own world. So now he set himself to work to build a scientific canoe. I had suggested that we construct a dugout, but Perry convinced me that we must build something more in keeping with our positions of supermen in this world of the Stone Age. "We must impress these natives with our superiority," he explained. "You must not forget, David, that you are Emperor of Pellucidar. As such, you may not with dignity approach the shores of a foreign power in so crude a vessel as a dugout." I pointed out to Perry that it wasn't much more incongruous for the Emperor to cruise in a canoe than it was for the Prime Minister to attempt to build one with his own hands. He had to smile at that, but in extenuation of his act he assured me that it was quite customary for Prime Ministers to give their personal attention to the building of imperial navies, and this, he said, is the imperial navy of His Serene Highness David I, Emperor of the Federated Kingdoms of Pellucidar. I grinned, but Perry was quite serious about it. It had always seemed rather more or less of a joke to me that I should be addressed as Majesty and all the rest of it, yet my imperial power and dignity had been a very real thing during my brief reign. 20 tribes had joined the Federation, and their chiefs had sworn eternal fealty to one another and to me. Among them were many powerful though savage nations. Their chiefs we had made kings, their tribal lands kingdoms. We had armed them with bows and arrows and swords, in addition to their own more primitive weapons. I had trained them in military discipline and in so much of the art of war as I had gleaned from extensive reading of the campaigns of Napoleon, von Moltke, Grant, and the ancients. We had marked out as best we could natural boundaries dividing the various kingdoms. We had warned tribes beyond these boundaries that they must not trespass, and we had marched against and severely punished those who had. We had met and defeated the Mayhars and the Sagoths. In short, we had demonstrated our right to empire, and very rapidly were we being recognized and heralded abroad when my departure for the outer world and Hooge's treachery had set us back. But now I had returned. The work that fate had undone must be done again, and though I must needs smile at my imperial honors, I none the less felt the weight of duty and obligation that rested upon my shoulders. Slowly the Imperial Navy progressed toward completion. She was a wondrous craft, but I had my doubts about her. When I voiced them to Perry, he reminded me gently that my people for many generations had been mine owners, not shipbuilders, and consequently I couldn't be expected to know much about the matter. I was minded to inquire into his hereditary fitness to design battleships, but inasmuch as I already knew that his father had been a minister in a backwoods village far from the coast, I hesitated lest I offend the dear old fellow. He was immensely serious about his work, and I must admit that in so far as appearances went, he did extremely well with the meager tools and assistants at his command. We had only two short axes and our hunting knives, yet with these we hewed trees, split them into planks, surfaced and fitted them. The Navy was some 40 feet in length by 10 feet beam. Her sides were quite straight and fully 10 feet high, for the purpose, explained Perry, of adding dignity to her appearance and rendering it less easy for an enemy to board her. As a matter of fact, I knew that he had had in mind the safety of her crew under javelin fire. The lofty sides made an admirable shelter. Inside, she reminded me of nothing so much as a floating trench. There was also some slight analogy to a huge coffin. Her prow sloped sharply backward from the water line, quite like a line of battleship. Perry had designed her more for moral effect upon an enemy, I think, than for any real harm she might inflict, and so those parts which were to show were the most imposing. Below the water line she was practically non-existent. She should have had considerable draft, but as the enemy couldn't have seen it, Perry decided to do away with it, and so made her flat bottom. It was this that caused my doubts about her. There was another little idiosyncrasy of design that escaped us both until she was about ready to launch. There was no method of propulsion. Her sides were far too high to permit the use of sweeps, and when Perry suggested that we pole her, I remonstrated on the grounds that it would be a most undignified and awkward manner of sweeping down upon the foe, even if we could find or wield poles that would reach to the bottom of the ocean. Finally, I suggested that we convert her into a sailing vessel. When once the idea took hold, Perry was most enthusiastic about it, and nothing would do but a four-masted, full-rigged ship. Again I tried to dissuade him, but he was simply crazy over the psychological effect which the appearance of this strange and mighty craft would have upon the natives of Pellucidar, so we rigged her with thin hides for sails and dried gut for rope. Neither of us knew much about sailing a full-rigged ship, but that didn't worry me a great deal, for I was confident that we should never be called upon to do so, and as the day of launching approached, I was positive of it. We had built her upon a low bank of the river, close to where it emptied into the sea, and just above high tide. Her keel we had laid upon several rollers cut from small trees. The ends of the rollers in turn rested upon parallel tracks of long saplings. Her stern was toward the water. A few hours before we were ready to launch her, she made quite an imposing picture, for Perry had insisted upon setting every shred of canvas. I told him that I didn't know much about it, but I was sure that at launching the hull only should have been completed, everything else being completed after she had floated safely. At the last minute there was some delay while we sought a name for her. I wanted her christened the Perry in honor both of her designer and that other great naval genius of another world, Captain Oliver Hazard Perry of the United States Navy. But Perry was too modest. He wouldn't hear of it. We finally decided to establish a system in the naming of the fleet. Battleships of the first class should bear the names of kingdoms of the Federation, armored cruisers the names of kings, cruisers the names of cities, and so on down the line. Therefore we decided to name the first battleship Sorry, after the first of the federated kingdoms. The launching of the Sorry proved easier than I contemplated. Perry wanted me to get in and break something over the bow as she floated out upon the bosom of the river, but I told him that I should feel safer on dry land until I saw which side up the sorry would float. I could see by the expression of the old man's face that my words had hurt him, but I noticed that he didn't offer to get in himself, and so I felt less contrition than I might otherwise. When we cut the ropes and removed the blocks that held the sorry in place, she started for the water with a lunge. Before she hit it, she was going at a reckless speed, for we had laid our tracks quite down to the water, greased them, and at intervals placed rollers all ready to receive the ship as she moved forward with stately dignity. But there was no dignity in the sorry. When she touched the surface of the river, she must have been going 20 or 30 miles an hour. Her momentum carried her well out into the stream, until she came to a sudden halt at the end of the long line which we had had the foresight to attach to her bow and fasten to a large tree upon the bank. The moment her progress was checked, she promptly capsized. Perry was overwhelmed. I didn't upbraid him, nor remind him that I had told him so. His grief was so genuine and so apparent that I didn't have the heart to reproach him, even were I inclined to that particular sort of meanness. "Come, come, old man," I cried, "it's not as bad as it looks. Give me a hand with this rope, and we'll drag her up as far as we can, and then when the tide goes out, we'll try another scheme. I think we can make a go of her yet." Well, we managed to get her up into shallow water. When the tide receded, she lay there on her side in the mud, quite a pitiable object for the premier battleship of a world. The terror of the sea was the way Perry had occasionally described her. We had to work fast, but before the tide came in again, we had stripped her of her sails and masts, righted her, and filled her about a quarter full of rock ballast. If she didn't stick too fast in the mud, I was sure that she would float this time right side up. I can tell you that it was with palpitating hearts that we sat upon the river bank and watched that tide come slowly in. The tides of Pellucidar don't amount to much by comparison with our higher tides of the outer world, but I knew that it ought to prove ample to float the sorry. Nor was I mistaken. Finally we had the satisfaction of seeing the vessel rise out of the mud and float slowly upstream with the tide. As the water rose, we pulled her in quite close to the bank and clambered aboard. She rested safely now upon an even keel, nor did she leak, for she was well caulked with fiber and tarry pitch. We rigged up a single short mast and light sail, fastened planking down over the ballast to form a deck, worked her out into midstream with a couple of sweeps, and dropped our primitive stone anchor to await the turn of the tide that would bear us out to sea. While we waited, we devoted the time to the construction of an upper deck, since the one immediately above the ballast was some 7 feet from the gunwale. The second deck was 4 feet above this. In it was a large commodious hatch leading to the lower deck. The sides of the ship rose 3 feet above the upper deck, forming an excellent breastwork, which we loopholed at intervals that we might lie prone and fire upon an enemy. Though we were sailing out upon a peaceful mission in search of my friend Jaw, we knew that we might meet with people of some other island who would prove unfriendly. At last the tide turned. We weighed anchor. Slowly we drifted down the great river toward the sea. About us swarmed the mighty denizens of the primeval deep, Plesiosauri and Ichthyosauria, with all their horrid, slimy cousins, whose names were as the names of aunts and uncles to Perry, but which I have never been able to recall an hour after having heard them. At last we were safely launched upon the journey to which we had looked forward for so long, and the results of which meant so much to me. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Pellucidar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 4. Friendship and Treachery. The Sari proved a most erratic craft. She might have done well enough in a park lagoon if safely anchored, but upon the bosom of a mighty ocean she left much to be desired. Sailing with the wind she did her best, but in quartering or when close hauled she drifted terribly, as a nautical man might have guessed she would. We couldn't keep within miles of our course, and our progress was pitifully slow. Instead of making for the island of Anarok, we bore far to the right, until it became evident that we should have to pass between the two right-hand islands and attempt to return toward Anarok from the opposite side. As we neared the islands, Perry was quite overcome by their beauty. When we were directly between two of them, he fairly went into raptures, nor could I blame him. The tropical luxuriance of the foliage that dripped almost to the water's edge, and the vivid colors of the blooms that shot the green, made a most gorgeous spectacle. Perry was right in the midst of a flowery panegyric on the wonders of the peaceful beauty of the scene, when a canoe shot out from the nearest island. There were a dozen warriors in it. It was quickly followed by a second and third. Of course we couldn't know the intentions of the strangers, but we could pretty well guess them. Perry wanted to man the sweeps and try to get away from them, but I soon convinced him that any speed of which the Sari was capable would be far too slow to outdistance the swift though awkward dugouts of the Mezobs. I waited until they were quite close enough to hear me, and then I hailed them. I told them that we were friends of the Mezobs, and that we were upon a visit to Ja of Anarok, to which they replied that they were at war with Ja, and that if we would wait a minute they'd board us and throw our corpses to the Azdiriths. I warned them that they would get the worst of it if they didn't leave us alone, but they only shouted in derision and paddled swiftly toward us. It was evident that they were considerably impressed by the appearance and dimensions of our craft, but as these fellows know no fear, they were not at all awed. Seeing that they were determined to give battle, I leaned over the rail of the Sari and brought the imperial battle squadron of the Emperor of Pellucidar into action for the first time in the history of a world. In other and simpler words, I fired my revolver at the nearest canoe. The effect was magical. A warrior rose from his knees, threw his paddle aloft, stiffened into rigidity for an instant, and then toppled overboard. The others ceased paddling, and with wide eyes looked first at me and then at the battling sea things which fought for the corpse of their comrade. To them it must have seemed a miracle that I should be able to stand at thrice the range of the most powerful javelin thrower, and with a loud noise and a smudge of smoke slay one of their number with an invisible missile. But only for an instant were they paralyzed with wonder. Then with savage shouts they fell once more to their paddles and forged rapidly toward us. Again and again I fired. At each shot a warrior sank to the bottom of the canoe or tumbled overboard. When the prow of the first craft touched the side of the Sari, it contained only dead and dying men. The other two dugouts were approaching rapidly, so I turned my attention toward them. I think that they must have been commencing to have some doubts, those wild, naked red warriors, for when the first man fell in the second boat, the others stopped paddling and commenced to jabber among themselves. The third boat pulled up alongside the second, and its crews joined in the conference. Taking advantage of the lull in the battle, I called out to the survivors to return to their shore. "I have no fight with you," I cried, and then I told them who I was, and added that if they would live in peace, they must sooner or later join forces with me. "Go back now to your people," I counseled them, "and tell them that you have seen David I, Emperor of the federated kingdoms of Pellucidar, and that single-handed he has overcome you, just as he intends overcoming the Mayhars and the Sagoths and any other peoples of Pellucidar who threaten the peace and welfare of his empire." Slowly they turned the noses of their canoes toward land. It was evident that they were impressed. Yet that they were loath to give up without further contesting my claim to naval supremacy was also apparent, for some of their number seemed to be exhorting the others to a renewal of the conflict. However, at last they drew slowly away, and the Sari, which had not decreased her snail-like speed during this her first engagement, continued upon her slow, uneven way. Presently Perry stuck his head up through the hatch and hailed me. "Have the scoundrels departed?" he asked. "Have you killed them all?" "Those whom I failed to kill have departed, Perry," I replied. He came out on deck, and peering over the side, descried the lone canoe floating a short distance astern with its grim and grisly freight. Farther his eyes wandered to the retreating boats. "David," said he at last, "this is a notable occasion. It is a great day in the annals of Pellucidar. We have won a glorious victory. Your Majesty's navy has routed a fleet of the enemy thrice its own size, manned by 10 times as many men. Let us give thanks." I could scarce restrain a smile at Perry's use of the pronoun we, yet I was glad to share the rejoicing with him, as I shall always be glad to share everything with the dear old fellow. Perry is the only male coward I have ever known whom I could respect and love. He was not created for fighting, but I think that if the occasion should ever arise where it became necessary, he would give his life cheerfully for me. Yes, I know it. It took us a long time to work around the islands and draw in close to Anoroc. In the leisure afforded, we took turns working on our map, and by means of the compass and a little guesswork we set down the shoreline we had left and the 3 islands with fair accuracy. Crossed sabers marked the spot where the first great naval engagement of a world had taken place. In a notebook we jotted down, as had been our custom, details that would be of historical value later. Opposite Anoroc we came to anchor quite close to shore. I knew from my previous experience with the tortuous trails of the island that I could never find my way inland to the hidden tree village of the Mezop chieftain Ja, so we remained aboard the Sari, firing our express rifles at intervals to attract the attention of the natives. After some 10 shots had been fired at considerable intervals, a body of copper-colored warriors appeared upon the shore. They watched us for a moment, and then I hailed them, asking the whereabouts of my old friend Ja. They did not reply at once, but stood with their heads together in serious and animated discussion. Continually they turned their eyes toward our strange craft. It was evident that they were greatly puzzled by our appearance, as well as unable to explain the source of the loud noises that had attracted their attention to us. At last one of the warriors addressed us. "Who are you who seek Ja?" he asked. "What would you of our chief?" "We are friends," I replied. "I am David. Tell Ja that David, whose life he once saved from a Scythic, has come again to visit him. If you will send out a canoe, we will come ashore. We cannot bring our great warship closer in." Again they talked for a considerable time. Then 2 of them entered a canoe that several dragged from its hiding place in the jungle and paddled swiftly toward us. They were magnificent specimens of manhood. Perry had never seen a member of this red race close to before. In fact, the dead men in the canoe we had left astern after the battle and the survivors who were paddling rapidly toward their shore were the first he had ever seen. He had been greatly impressed by their physical beauty and the promise of superior intelligence which their well-shaped skulls gave. The 2 who now paddled out received us into their canoe with dignified courtesy. To my inquiries relative to Ja, they explained that he had not been in the village when our signals were heard, but that runners had been sent out after him, and that doubtless he was already upon his way to the coast. One of the men remembered me from the occasion of my former visit to the island. He was extremely agreeable the moment that he came close enough to recognize me. He said that Ja would be delighted to welcome me, and that all the tribe of Anoroc knew of me by repute and had received explicit instructions from their chieftain that if any of them should ever come upon me, to show me every kindness and attention. Upon shore we were received with equal honor. While we stood conversing with our bronze friends, a tall warrior leaped suddenly from the jungle. It was Ja. As his eyes fell upon me, his face lighted with pleasure. He came quickly forward to greet me after the manner of his tribe. Toward Perry he was equally hospitable. The old man fell in love with the savage giant as completely as had I. Ja conducted us along the maze-like trail to his strange village, where he gave over one of the tree houses for our exclusive use. Perry was much interested in the unique habitation, which resembled nothing so much as a huge wasp's nest built around the bole of a tree well above the ground. After we had eaten and rested, Ja came to see us with a number of his head men. They listened attentively to my story, which included a narrative of the events leading to the formation of the federated kingdoms, the battle with the Mayhars, my journey to the outer world, and my return to Pellucidar and search for Sari and my mate. Ja told me that the Mezops had heard something of the federation and had been much interested in it. He had even gone so far as to send a party of warriors toward Sari to investigate the reports and to arrange for the entrance of Anauroch into the empire in case it appeared that there was any truth in the rumors that one of the aims of the federation was the overthrow of the Mayhars. The delegation had met with a party of Sagos. As there had been a truce between the Mayhars and the Mezops for many generations, they camped with these warriors of the reptiles, from whom they learned that the federation had gone to pieces. So the party returned to Anauroch. When I showed Ja our map and explained its purpose to him, he was much interested. The location of Anauroch, the mountains of the clouds, the river, and the strip of seacoast were all familiar to him. He quickly indicated the position of the inland sea, and close beside it the city of Phutra, where one of the powerful Mayhar nations had its seat. He likewise showed us where Sari should be, and carried his own coastline as far north and south as it was known to him. His additions to the map convinced us that Greenwich lay upon the verge of this same sea, and that it might be reached by water more easily than by the arduous crossing of the mountains or the dangerous approach through Phutra, which lay almost directly in line between Anauroch and Greenwich to the northwest. If Sari lay upon the same water, then the shoreline must bend far back toward the southwest of Greenwich, an assumption which, by the way, we found later to be true. Also, Sari was upon a lofty plateau at the southern end of a mighty gulf of the great ocean. The location which Ja gave to distant Amoz puzzled us, for it placed it due north of Greenwich, apparently in mid-ocean. As Ja had never been so far and knew only of Amoz through hearsay, we thought that he must be mistaken. But he was not. Amoz lies directly north of Greenwich, across the mouth of the same gulf as that upon which Sari is. The sense of direction and location of these primitive Pellucidarians is little short of uncanny, as I have had occasion to remark in the past. You may take one of them to the uttermost ends of his world, to places of which he has never even heard, yet without sun or moon or stars to guide him, without map or compass, he will travel straight for home in the shortest direction. Mountains, rivers, and seas may have to be gone around, but never once does his sense of direction fail him. The homing instinct is supreme. In the same remarkable way, they never forget the location of any place to which they have ever been, and know that of many of which they have only heard from others who have visited them. In short, each Pellucidarian is a walking geography of his own district and of much of the country contiguous thereto. It always proved of the greatest aid to Perry and me. Nevertheless, we were anxious to enlarge our map, for we at least were not endowed with the homing instinct. After several long councils, it was decided that in order to expedite matters, Perry should return to the prospector with a strong party of Mezops and fetch the freight I had brought from the outer world. Ja and his warriors were much impressed by our firearms, and were also anxious to build boats with sails. As we had arms at the Prospector, and also books on boat building, we thought that it might prove an excellent idea to start these naturally maritime people upon the construction of a well built navy of staunch sailing vessels. I was sure that with definite plans to go by, Perry could oversee the construction of an adequate flotilla. I warned him, however, not to be too ambitious, and to forget about dreadnoughts and armored cruisers for a while, and build instead a few small sailing boats that could be manned by 4 or 5 men. I was to proceed to Sari, and while prosecuting my search for Diane, attempt at the same time the rehabilitation of the Federation. Perry was going as far as possible by water, with the chances that the entire trip might be made in that manner, which proved to be the fact. With a couple of Mezops as companions, I started for Sari. In order to avoid crossing the principal range of the mountains of the clouds, we took a route that passed a little way south of Phutra. We had eaten 4 times and slept once, and were, as my companions told me, not far from the great Mayhar city, when we were suddenly confronted by a considerable band of Sagoths. They did not attack us, owing to the peace which exists between the Mayhars and the Mezops, but I could see that they looked upon me with considerable suspicion. My friends told them that I was a stranger from a remote country, and as we had previously planned against such a contingency, I pretended ignorance of the language which the human beings of Pellucidar employ in conversing with the gorilla-like soldiery of the Mayhars. I noticed, and not without misgivings, that the leader of the Sagoths eyed me with an expression that betokened partial recognition. I was sure that he had seen me before during the period of my incarceration in Phutra, and that he was trying to recall my identity. It worried me not a little. I was extremely thankful when we bade them adieu and continued upon our journey. Several times during the next few marches I became acutely conscious of the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, but I did not speak of my suspicions to my companions. Later I had reason to regret my reticence, for, well, this is how it happened. We had killed an antelope, and after eating our fill I had lain down to sleep. The Pellucidarians, who seem seldom, if ever, to require sleep, joined me in this instance, for we had a very trying march along the northern foothills of the mountains of the clouds, and now, with their bellies filled with meat, they seemed ready for slumber. When I awoke, it was with a start to find a couple of huge Sagoths astride me. They pinioned my arms and legs, and later chained my wrists behind my back. Then they let me up. I saw my companions. The brave fellows lay dead where they had slept, javelined to death without a chance at self-defense. I was furious. I threatened the Sagoth leader with all sorts of dire reprisals, but when he heard me speak the hybrid language that is the medium of communication between his kind and the human race of the inner world, he only grinned, as much as to say, "I thought so." They had not taken my revolvers or ammunition away from me because they did not know what they were, but my heavy rifle I had lost. They simply left it where it had lain beside me. So low in the scale of intelligence are they, that they had not sufficient interest in this strange object even to fetch it along with them. I knew from the direction of our march that they were taking me to Phutra. Once there, I did not need much of an imagination to picture what my fate would be. It was the arena and a wild thag or fierce tarag for me, unless the Mayhars elected to take me to the pits. In that case my end would be no more certain, though infinitely more horrible and painful, for in the pits I should be subjected to cruel vivisection. From what I had once seen of their methods in the pits of Phutra, I knew them to be the opposite of merciful, whereas in the arena I should be quickly dispatched by some savage beast. Arrived at the underground city, I was taken immediately before a slimy Mayhar. When the creature had received the report of the Sagoth, its cold eyes glistened with malice and hatred as they were turned balefully upon me. I knew then that my identity had been guessed. With a show of excitement that I had never before seen evinced by a member of the dominant race of Pellucidar, the Mayhar hustled me away, heavily guarded, through the main avenue of the city to one of the principal buildings. Here we were ushered into a great hall where presently many Mayhars gathered. In utter silence they conversed, for they have no oral speech since they are without auditory nerves. Their method of communication Perry has likened to the projection of a sixth sense into a fourth dimension, where it becomes cognizable to the sixth sense of their audience. Be that as it may, however, it was evident that I was the subject of discussion, and from the hateful looks bestowed upon me, not a particularly pleasant subject. How long I waited for their decision I do not know, but it must have been a very long time. Finally one of the Sagoths addressed me. He was acting as interpreter for his masters. "The Mayhars will spare your life," he said, "and release you on one condition." "And what is that condition?" I asked, though I could guess its terms. "That you return to them that which you stole from the pits of Phutra when you killed the 4 Mayhars and escaped," he replied. I had thought that that would be it. The great secret upon which depended the continuance of the Mayhar race was safely hid where only Diane and I knew. I ventured to imagine that they would have given me much more than my liberty to have it safely in their keeping again. But after that, what? Would they keep their promises? I doubted it. With the secret of artificial propagation once more in their hands, their numbers would soon be made so to overrun the world of Pellucidar that there could be no hope for the eventual supremacy of the human race, the cause for which I so devoutly hoped, for which I had consecrated my life, and for which I was not willing to give my life. Yes, in that moment, as I stood before the heartless tribunal, I felt that my life would be a very little thing to give could it save to the human race of Pellucidar the chance to come into its own by ensuring the eventual extinction of the hated, powerful Mayhars. "Come!" exclaimed the Sagoths. "The mighty Mayhars await your reply." "You may say to them," I answered, "that I shall not tell them where the great secret is hid." When this had been translated to them, there was a great beating of reptilian wings, gaping of sharp-fanged jaws, and hideous hissing. I thought that they were about to fall upon me on the spot, and so I laid my hands upon my revolvers. But at length they became more quiet, and presently transmitted some command to my Sagoth guard, the chief of which laid a heavy hand upon my arm and pushed me roughly before him from the audience chamber. They took me to the pits, where I lay carefully guarded. I was sure that I was to be taken to the vivisection laboratory, and it required all my courage to fortify myself against the terrors of so fearful a death. In Pellucidar, where there is no time, death agonies may endure for eternities. Accordingly, I had to steel myself against an endless doom, which now stared me in the face. End of chapter 4.